Take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I get tired.
In one of his most famous speeches, Dr. King talked about his dream for the future. This is what he said. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
Precious Lord, lead me on.
Imagine this if you can. It's the early 60s and you're a young woman attending a segregated high school. You've taken time off from school to join your parents and some of your classmates on a nonviolent protest march against segregation and racial discrimination. You don't understand why segregation is allowed, but right now, you don't care. You're enjoying the feeling of unity among the peaceful protesters as you march with them in the warm southern sunshine. Suddenly, several lines of policemen appear. The front line is being pulled forward by fierce-looking German shepherds on leashes. Behind them, more police are dragging fire hoses. All the police are heavily armed. The front line of officers surges forward, and without warning, the dogs are on the crowd, snarling and biting. People scream, and your parents yell at you to run for your life. But you can't escape, because now they've turned on the fire hoses, and the force of the water slams you into the ground. You lie there, drenched, dazed, and terrified as the dogs continue to harass the crowd. You don't realize it, but you've just been initiated into the world of civil rights protesters.
Now, fast forward to the present day and imagine this. You're a poorly educated 15-year-old girl living in a small Mexican town. One day, you're taken from your hometown by a woman who promises you a well-paid job as a housekeeper with a family in California. But the job is a lie, and the woman who promised it sells you to an older white man for a mere $200. You've become a modern-day sex and work slave. For 5 long years, you're periodically raped and beaten and forced to clean houses for 18 to 20 hours a day. And to remind you how trapped you are, your boss forces you to watch him digging the grave into which you'll be thrown if you try to escape.
The suffering of victims of modern-day human trafficking is different from the indignities suffered by victims of racial discrimination in the 1950s and 60s. But segregation and human trafficking have one despicable thing in common. They both represent gross violations of people's fundamental human rights. The emotions that created segregation dated all the way back to the abolition of slavery after the Civil War, which left the country divided, resentful, and suspicious. The bigotry and prejudice that was subsequently shown towards African Americans was supported by Jim Crow laws consisting of repressive legislation that was later ruled unconstitutional. Modern-day human trafficking has arisen from different motives and does not have the same history as segregation. Today, trafficking consists of enforced labor and sexual slavery and is driven by lust, cruelty, financial gain, and a lack of compassion. It is perpetuated by criminal organizations as well as corrupt individuals and is illegal in most countries in the world. Human trafficking is a global problem. It's estimated that there are nearly 30 million slaves in the world today. They are men, women, and children who are forced to work and barely subsist. They live in fear and are subjected to all kinds of horrific sexual abuse. But although human trafficking occurs internationally, nowhere is it more prevalent than right here in the United States. In 2013, the U.S. government estimated that approximately 27 million men, women, and children were victims of human trafficking, and more than 300,000 children were trafficked within the U.S. annually. Those figures have almost certainly grown since then. Even in Atlanta, a cradle of the civil rights movement, the practice is festering. The FBI has identified Atlanta as having one of the largest sex trafficking industries in the U.S., with nearly half of the victims being underage and subjected to sexual exploitation. This is a far cry from the vision held by the 16th President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln made slavery illegal when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and helped to push the 13th Amendment through Congress. This historic amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery. Just over 100 years later, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964, making most forms of racial segregation illegal. This package of laws was formulated to protect minorities and to empower the federal government to protect the rights of citizens against state and local laws. Schools were integrated, sometimes under the watch of the National Guard, and other forms of segregation were declared illegal. It was the culmination of social advances made by generations of civil rights activists and carried the hope that their sacrifices and suffering had not been in vain. In 1965, LBJ achieved passage of a second civil rights bill, the Voting Rights Act. This outlawed discrimination in voting and allowed millions of African Americans to vote for the first time. The groundwork for these historic acts was laid by Dr. King, working in harmony with contemporaries such as Ralph David Abernathy and John Lewis. These and many other activists had brought the issue of civil rights into the country's consciousness and placed it where it belonged, on a national stage. The Emancipation Proclamation may have made slavery illegal, but it did not end marginalization. By the same token, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 could not guarantee freedom from discrimination. Outlawing oppression and racial hatred is not the same thing as eliminating it. Despite the heroic efforts of the civil rights pioneers, the sad fact is that there may well be more people enslaved in the world today than when Lincoln introduced his historic proclamation, and more than when Dr. King made his renowned "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963.